Hi, this is Mahmood. Welcome to the Center for Inner Awakening. As human beings, we normally experience three levels of perception: physical, emotional, and mental perception. The physical body operates through the five sensory perception. Your emotional perception is sometimes based on positive emotions and sometimes negative emotions. Your mental perception is based on the faculties of the mind, the intellect, your ability to rationalize, your cognition, your analytical skills, your ability to reason, your short-term memory, your long-term memory. These are all components of your mental perception. So generally speaking, the three levels that we experience on a day-to-day basis are either physical, emotional, or mental. There is another level of perception that takes place at a much higher level of consciousness. I call it spiritual consciousness. There is a phenomenal book written by Dr. David Hawkins. It's called Power versus Force. David Hawkins is an internationally renowned psychiatrist and a spiritual teacher. So in his book, he talks about a map of human consciousness. This map starts at the level 0 and it goes all the way up to 1,000. So he basically talks about the different levels of consciousness, from the basic level of consciousness to the highest level of consciousness. So David Hawkins mentions in his book that the majority of the people on this planet operate at a basic level of consciousness. That level of consciousness takes place at the level 200. So the majority of the people on the planet are operating at a 200 level of consciousness. At this level of consciousness, individuals find it challenging to achieve control over their negative emotions and achieve control over their negative thoughts. So for example, negative emotions such as anger, fear, sadness, despondency, despair, so on and so forth. So the individuals operating at this basic level of consciousness have a challenge with the negative emotions and the negative thoughts. So as we go higher up on the scale of consciousness, the next major level of consciousness takes place at the level 400. This is the level of reason. It is at this level of consciousness that awakening of the intellect takes place. At this level, knowledge and education are at a premium. An individual may decide to increase their knowledge in the field of science, medicine, politics, philosophy. Someone may choose to become a scholar. There are many other areas that an individual can choose. So a person at this level seeks out academic institutions where possibly they can earn their masters or PhDs. So many years of seeking knowledge in a specific field is taken by this individual. And once this individual graduates, he or she wishes to make an impact with their knowledge on others. Quite often they can make an impact on small communities and quite often on large communities. The next level of consciousness takes place at the level 500. This is the level of unconditional love. This level is much higher than the intellect. When we say unconditional love, we're not talking about emotional love. We are not even talking about human love that one person has for another. It is a much higher form of love. This is where awakening of spirituality takes place. So a person resonating at this level has a very high level of frequency. One person at the level of 500 can counterbalance 750,000 at the 200 level. This is what the level of their consciousness is. So a person who is resonating with unconditional love is giving off a form of energy which is a totally different level or a totally different type of energy. It is a type of forgiving love that is constantly coming out from their soul. So it's at this level that activation of the soul or activation of spirituality takes place. If we go up the scale of consciousness, the next major level of consciousness takes place at the 600 level. This is where self-realization or God consciousness takes place. Only 1 out of 10 million people can achieve this level. A person who has achieved a level of consciousness at the 600 level, one person at that level can counterbalance 10 million other people at the 200 level. So it's an extremely high level of consciousness. As we go up the scale of consciousness on the map of consciousness, the next major level of consciousness takes place at the level 700. Now the level 700 to 1000 is a very special level. It's reserved for those great entities, the spiritually enlightened masters, the prophets, the sages, the saints. This level of 700 is the level of enlightenment. It's the level of divinity. All the great prophets and all the great masters who have made a significant impact on humanity and history are in this category. One person at the level 700 can counterbalance 70 million other people at the level of 200. So one person's enlightenment at the level 700 can counter 70 million other individuals on the planet at a basic level of consciousness. Now, within this particular frame, within this boundary of 700 to 1000, there are different levels of enlightenment. So if you have a person who is resonating at the 700 level, who can counterbalance 70 million others, the 700 level is different compared to the 750 level, and the 750 level is different compared to the 800 level. So within enlightenment, there are levels within levels. So David Hawkins basically explains in his book that 85% of the population on this planet is resonating at a 200 level. The remaining 15% are at a higher level. And he explains in his book that the 15%, the level of consciousness and the level of enlightenment that the 15% have received, can completely counterbalance the basic level of consciousness that the 85% of the population has. So if 85% of the people are resonating at the 200 level, the 15% who are resonating at a higher level can completely counterbalance those 85%. Now there's another phenomenal book written by Michael Newton. He has a PhD in psychology. He uses regression therapy to help others, to heal others. He's mastered a couple of techniques. He mentions in his wonderful book, Journey of Souls. If you would like that book, it's a wonderful book. Journey of Souls by Michael Newton. He mentions in his book that 3/4 of the souls on earth are young or beginner souls. So he categorizes souls in 3 different categories: young or beginner souls, intermediate souls, and old souls. So he says that 3/4 of the people on this planet are beginner or young souls. Their level of consciousness is limited. Then there's a few souls at the intermediate level. They seem to be more independent. They don't follow the mainstream people. They have their own things to do. And then from a large group of people, very, very, very few are old souls. So the older souls here means the level of their consciousness, the level of their enlightenment is higher. So what Michael Newton is saying in his book, Journey of Souls, is very similar to what Dr. David Hawkins is saying in Power versus Force. David Hawkins is saying that 85% of the people are at a basic level of consciousness, the 200 level. And Michael Newton is saying the same thing, that 3/4 of the people on this planet are beginner or young souls. If we were to take a closer look at our planet today, look at all the difficulties and look at all the problems that we're having. All you need to do is turn on the news channel. Political conflicts, religious conflicts, people killing each other in the name of religion, power, corruption, greed, tension within families, family problems, relationship problems, physical abuse, mental abuse. Do you think that a person at a lower level of consciousness would act this way or commit these actions, or a higher level? Obviously, the reason all these difficulties and all these problems are taking place is because a lot of us are operating at a very basic level of consciousness. We don't have control over negative emotions such as anger, fear, sadness, control, jealousy, manipulation. When you don't have control over your basic emotions like that, chances are your actions are going to be very negative. Some people have very negative mental thoughts. It's very difficult for them to go towards positive thinking or positive energy. So one of the main reasons we have so many conflicts on this planet is because most of the souls on this planet are operating at a very basic level of consciousness. So they have to try harder to bring their level of consciousness to a higher level. If all the Muslim scholars were to combine their knowledge would be a small drop compared to the knowledge, wisdom, and enlightenment of Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad is known as the mercy of all the universes. He was the PhD of PhDs. If all the great Christian scholars were to combine their knowledge, their combined knowledge which would only be a small drop compared to the knowledge, wisdom, and enlightenment of Jesus Christ. Christ is the very embodiment of love and compassion. He was the scholar of all scholars. The Holy Quran essentially has an esoteric foundation. Prophet Muhammad claimed that every verse of the Quran has two meanings, the external meaning and the internal meaning. And then he said, I will share the external meaning with you, but I will not be able to share the internal meaning. If I was to share the internal meaning with you, it'll break your throat. At that time, the words break your throat meant it'll put you in utter confusion. You'll be completely confused. You will not be able to understand it. You will not be able to digest it. The external meaning here can also be referred to as the basic meaning, the logical meaning, the meaning that we'll be able to understand on a human level, that we'll be able to comprehend. It can also mean the literal meaning, where you don't have to think much. So the Prophet has always brought down, the Prophet and other masters who have brought down revelations and knowledge, they have to bring that knowledge down to our level so we can understand it. The individual consciousness of enlightened masters is one with the essence. That level of enlightenment where there is no shape, no colors, no form. There's nothing tangible there. There are no words, there are no formulas, there are no numbers. It's incomprehensible to the human intellect. So they're taking the knowledge and the essence of that level, which has no shape, color, or form, and they're bringing it down to our level so that we can get basic knowledge, basic principles, fundamental principles, allegories, symbolism, examples of how to live your life, what choices to make, what kind of karma to make. So basic instructions for human beings which you can carry out on a day-to-day basis so that you can improve your personal and your spiritual growth. So enlightened masters have to go from that dimension of no form, nothing tangible, no shape, no color, no form, to this dimension of shape, color, and form. And then their guidance comes in the form of knowledge, basic principles, fundamental principles, the Islamic laws known as the Sharia. Christians follow other laws, the Jews follow other laws. So basic instructions on a basic level that we can comprehend. There can be many different interpretations of a Holy Scripture. A scholar that belongs to one denomination will interpret one way. A scholar that belongs to a different denomination in the same religion will interpret a different way. A philosopher will come up with a different interpretation. A scientist will come up with a different interpretation. A dictator will come up with a different interpretation. A fundamentalist will come up with a different interpretation. Knowledge can quite often turn into dogma and indoctrination. It's okay to interpret. We need some basic level of interpretation, but we must make sure that interpretations don't cause conflict with others. They don't cause harm to others. If you come up with an interpretation that causes harm within your particular faith or denomination, or in a different denomination, or to anyone else on a political level or on a religious level, then that interpretation is not right, because it's causing harm. The reason that the Prophet Muhammad, Jesus Christ, Krishna, or any other master brought down knowledge is so that it can help us to improve our personal growth and our spiritual growth, not to cause conflict. Today there are many, many different interpretations of all the scriptures. Whether it's the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, or the Gita, there are many different interpretations. There are many different levels of consciousness. Egos come in all shapes and sizes. There are egos at the physical level, there are egos at the emotional level, there are egos at the mental and intellectual level, and also there are egos at the spiritual level. A person who is in the process of increasing their intellectual knowledge, it could be through science, it could be through medicine, it could be through philosophy, it could be through religion. I believe that music, art, poetry, nature, these are all different aspects of God. These are all blessings of God that we have received. So it's good to pursue knowledge in science. It's good to pursue knowledge in philosophy. It's good to pursue knowledge as a scholar. There's nothing wrong with that you're expanding your knowledge. But while we are in the process of seeking this knowledge, we must not get arrogant, because egos exist on all levels. On a physical and emotional level, there's all kinds of levels where you can get stuck. For example, if you haven't achieved control over anger, fear, sadness, despondency, control, jealousy, then that becomes a form of ego. So the point of our journey is to transcend that. On a mental or an intellectual level, say you have a scholar who has sought knowledge for many, many years, but then at the end the scholar becomes arrogant, then that very knowledge that he's been seeking for most of his life becomes a barrier for his spiritual growth. If you think that the knowledge that you've received, it's higher or different, or has a greater weight compared to others, then that's a wrong way of thinking. That becomes an ego. So we have to be careful when we're enjoying these gifts of God, these different aspects of God, whether it's music or philosophy or art or poetry. We must stay humble. Don't get arrogant, because arrogance can kick in at any time. Even at the spiritual level, there are different levels of ego. At the physical level, you can say it's gross ego, it's a dark ego. At least you can notice it. But at the spiritual level, it's a white ego, it's an invisible ego. There are stories of great angels who have achieved great heights of spirituality, who have become arrogant and who have fallen. This is the story of fallen angels. If you look at the story in the Quran, there's the story of Iblis, one of the greatest angels. He had achieved a great height of spirituality. He had many other angels under his command. And then there's the allegory, there's a story in the Quran where God tells him to bow to Adam. and he refuses to bow. After that, God exiled him from his kingdom. He took a bunch of other angels with him. If you look at the story of Satan in the Bible, Satan was a very highly elevated angel with great authority, very, very capable of accomplishing great tasks for God. What happened to Satan? He became arrogant. He had achieved such a high level of spirituality, such a high level of knowledge, but in the end, he became arrogant. So God exiled him from the heavens. When he left heaven, he took a bunch of angels with him. They say the story is in the Bible. The story is also in the book of Enoch. In a very similar way, if you look at the Vedas, the Hindu scriptures, the oldest scriptures in the world, there's a wonderful story of the king of angels known as Indra. Even he became arrogant. Indra was so powerful that he controlled all the forces of nature. All the angels that controlled the forces of nature were actually under his command. And the story is that he became so arrogant that he waged a war against Krishna, who was supposed to be Vishnu, meaning God Almighty. So God Almighty manifested in the form of Krishna. So the ego has many different shapes and sizes. So as we can see from the examples in the Holy Scriptures, even angels can reach a very high level of spirituality, a very high level of knowledge, a very high level of wisdom, and yet it is possible to become arrogant. So we must be careful of that. Most of us are at a basic level of consciousness. Angels are at a very high level of consciousness. So if ego can take place at this level, it can definitely take place at our level. So we're here, angels are here, and then the enlightened masters are at the highest level. So we must keep in mind at all times, staying humble is very important. We can seek knowledge, we can seek wisdom, but it's important not to get arrogant. There's one particular event during the lifetime of the Prophet that was very special. There are many special events that have taken place during the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, but this one is very special. It really stands out. It was the spiritual ascent or journey of the Holy Prophet. This is known as Miraj. The individual consciousness of Prophet Muhammad became one with the universal consciousness. The level of enlightenment that the Prophet achieved was so high that even the Archangel Gabriel could not go there. That's how the high level was. For many years, the scholars, religious leaders, and historians have debated as to what the significance of this holy night was. What really happened to the Prophet at that time? And different people have come up with different interpretations. Some have come up with a very physical, literal interpretation. There was one other entity who truly understood the true meaning of Miraj. His name was Hazrat Ali. Ali was one of the greatest enlightened masters to ever be born on this planet. He was an ocean of knowledge, wisdom, and enlightenment. As I mentioned earlier, every verse of the Quran had two meanings, internal and external. And he said, I will share the external meaning with everyone, but I will not share the internal meaning because you won't be able to understand it. It'll break your throat, meaning you'll be confused. The internal meaning of every verse of the Quran was always shared with Hazrat Ali because Hazrat Ali was at that level to be able to understand it. So both Prophet Muhammad and Hazrat Ali were great enlightened masters. Let's assume for a moment there is an individual who has achieved a PhD in mathematics. He spent many years learning and finally ended up getting a PhD. Now, let's say that this person who has achieved a PhD in mathematics wants to teach math at a primary school level. So let's say grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5. If he wants to teach math at a primary level, he has to come down to their level. he has to take the concept of mathematics and dilute it and bring it down to the grade 3, 4, and 5 level. Otherwise, they won't be able to understand it. Let's say this PhD wants to teach high school students. He has to take the concept of mathematics and bring it to a high school level so that they can understand it. Let's assume for a moment that this PhD wants to share a concept of mathematics that's at a PhD level, but he wants to share it with high school students. What would happen then? So let's say he taught high school students at the level of PhD. What would happen? Most of them will not understand what he's saying. If the PhD asks the high school students, tell me in your own language and in your own understanding what I'm telling you, what would happen is that the students would dilute that concept, which is at a PhD level. They would dilute it to their level, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, and they would make sense out of it at their level. So they wouldn't be able to grasp the truth of what the PhD student is teaching, but they would only be able to grasp at their level. So in a similar way, enlightened masters, their consciousness is one with the essence. Their consciousness is one with that level where there is no shape, color, or form. There is no words, there's no numbers, there's no concepts. So they're going from that dimension, that shapeless and formless dimension, to this dimension where there's shape, form, and color. So they're taking the essence and the knowledge and they're bringing it down to a very basic level. So knowledge can come out as basic principles, fundamental principles, symbolism, allegories, parables. It can come out in the form of basic knowledge known as Sharia, the Islamic law. Christians have their knowledge, Jews have their knowledge, and other religious sects have their knowledge too. But the enlightened master has to come down from a very high level and bring that knowledge down to a very basic level so that we would be able to understand it. So going back to that example of the PhD, he has to come down to our level, to the kids' level, to teach to them. And that's what the masters do with us. But let's assume for a moment that when the PhD was explaining a concept of math and there was another PhD there with him, what would happen then? Obviously, the other PhD would be able to understand what this teacher is saying because they're both at the PhD level. So in the same way, Hazrat Ali and Prophet Muhammad, they were both enlightened masters and they understood completely the physical, spiritual, esoteric, and divine meanings. So Hazrat Ali became the successor of Prophet Muhammad, one of the greatest enlightened masters in the history of mankind. Enlightenment is not just limited to one particular person, race, or religion. It is universal. There have been spiritually enlightened souls who have gone down to all different parts of creation at different times. There were the Zen masters of Japan, the wise men of China, the Sikh gurus like Guru Nanak, the Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato, Sri Krishna and Ved Vyas, the divider of the Vedas in India, Gautama, the Buddha, Sant Kabir, the descendants of Abraham. According to Prophet Muhammad, there was 124,000 prophets before him. They were all enlightened as well. So as we can see, over the course of history, many different enlightened masters have come down on this planet. If these masters did not come down and share their wisdom, knowledge, and enlightenment with us, creation would simply fall apart. There would be no guidance, there would be no justice, there would be no knowledge. It's because of these great enlightened masters that we have some knowledge, we have some guidance, we have that chance to go up on the scale of spirituality. So, going back to the map of consciousness, we start from a very basic level and we have to make our way up to a very high level, a high level of spirituality. A lot of us are at the basic level of consciousness. The reason we come to Earth is to increase our personal growth. The reason we come to Earth is to experience our spiritual growth. And ultimately, we want to go into enlightenment. So it's necessary for us to stay humble. it's necessary for us not to become arrogant. As we mentioned before, there are egos on many different levels, going from the physical to the spiritual level. So this brings us to the end of our discussion. Wishing you all the best, and hopefully we'll see you again. Take care for now.